Hey y'all, welcome to Prepper Friday. I'm Madden from Self-Reliance Publishing, and today I want to share with you a little bit about my Grandma Lily and Granddaddy Bray Boy. These were my great-grandparents on my father's side, and they very much lived a self-reliance lifestyle. And I want to share with you a little bit about their lifestyle and why you should care as a prepper. Now, I've said in many of my videos that prepping ought to be a lifestyle. If you want to be a prepper, you should start preparing yourself with the skills that you need to be self-reliant now. It's not just about purchasing items. It's also about learning skills and producing, and you're going to be in a better position to do that if you start practicing it now. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about my great-grandparents and how they lived their life, and really I'm trying to strive to mimic a lot of their lifestyle. Not 100%, there's going to be a couple tweaks in there. Times have changed, situations different, so there's got to be some changes, obviously. But I want to mimic with my life much of what they did, 3 generations ago. But my great-grandfather worked. He had a full-time job. He was a teacher slash bus driver slash principal for a Indian school in South Carolina, just south of the border with North Carolina. But what he made didn't make enough to really provide for their family and put food on the table. So they had to rely on their garden and their livestock to produce food that they would both sell for extra income and eat for themselves, obviously. But they had a very large garden that they produced some staples and some vegetable crops, your typical things that you'd find in a vegetable garden: lettuce, tomato, okra, cucumbers, sweet corn. They'd also grow some staples like beans. They did mainly green beans, but also had some dried beans as well. Sweet potatoes. They produce enough for their family to eat, but they also shot to produce a little bit extra so that they could sell it to the community around them and generate a little bit of extra income. And I think that's a takeaway there. As a prepper, when you're planning, you should plan to not provide just enough for yourself, but you should shoot to produce a little bit more so that you have some extra to trade. And if you run into a problem and you have some shortfalls in some areas, you have a little bit of a buffer. And if everything goes well, you've got some stuff that you can barter and trade, which is exactly what my great-grandparents did. They also fished for panfish, or primarily. And they hunted. My great-grandfather had a .22 rifle that he used primarily. As far as I know, that's all he ever had, was a .22 rifle. And he hunted small game with it. And I understand he shot fish as well. I can only assume maybe carp. He would shoot with a .22 rifle. And he was a very good marksman. It was pretty much one shot, one kill. He didn't have very many guns, so he was very proficient with the ones that he did have. And he'd go out with 3 bullets and come back with 3 rabbits or 3 squirrels or what have you. I mean, I'm sure he missed occasionally, but that was the exception. When he pulled the trigger, he expected to bring an animal home. And he would use whatever was the cheapest. His rifle was a chambered for .22 long rifle, but most of the time he used .22 shorts because that was what was most economical back in his time. For livestock, they would have hogs that they raised. They also had chickens that they produced eggs, and when a hen got old and was no longer laying well, they would call that hen out and use it as a stew hen. And they saved their extra produce. They had a freezer full of meat from their hogs and chickens that they slaughtered, as well as fish that they caught. They would stock up and put in the freezer. They would freeze a lot of their extra produce that they didn't consume when it was fresh, and they didn't sell. They also canned a lot of their produce and to preserve it for later use. Where they lived, water table was really high, so they couldn't have a root cellar, but they'd store potatoes by piling them in a shady spot and then covering them with some straw and dirt. And as they needed potatoes, they'd dig those out and use them as needed. So they always had a very large food store on hand. They stored what they ate and they ate what they grew. And I think that's a key element right there. If more preppers would focus on that one phrase, I think they would be on safer ground and a little bit further ahead in the game. If you store what you eat and you eat what you grow, you're going to be in a good position. Now, back in their time, the supply chain tended to be a little bit more local than it was today. So they weren't necessarily as concerned with producing everything themselves. For instance, they bought most of the feed for their chickens and for their hogs. They didn't produce all of that themselves, but they would go to the feed mill and they would buy that feed. But the difference between then and now is that they had a feed mill right down the road from them, and that feed mill was buying corn and other feed products that was produced by the farmer that was also right down the road in the same county with them. And for the most part, those fields were plowed using mules, and they were harvested using their own two hands. So there wasn't a huge infrastructure that feed was resting on. Today, if you were to rely on feed, you're really relying on a much larger infrastructure to get that feed to you. And if there was some sort of collapse, that would be a bigger problem and a bigger burden to overcome. So now my focus is even producing the feed that my animals eat, just to be a little bit safer and have an extra layer of self-reliance. Food is not everything though when it comes to self-reliance. You also have shelter and heating, keeping your core body temperature to where it needs to be. So heating and cooling is an aspect. And they heated their house with used motor oil and with kerosene. They didn't do a whole lot with wood, and they really didn't take too much of passive solar into consideration either, which is something that I would definitely look into personally. But their house was painted white. They had white roofs to help reflect some of that sunlight and make sure it didn't absorb the sun during the heat of the summer. And like I said, during the wintertime, they heated it with used motor oil and would supplement that with store-bought kerosene as needed. For water, they had a well out front with a pitcher pump that you pump with your hands to get water to come out. And for medical treatment, they would definitely go to the doctor, but they also had their own home remedies. And I can't go into all of that here in this video as it would get way too long, but I do plan on making some future videos about different, like an herb garden that you can have for medical purposes, and different alternative medical treatments is something that I want to study up on myself and implement in my own little homestead here and share with y'all. And for extra income, that, like I had already mentioned, they produced more than they needed and they sold the excess. So they sold extra produce, they sold extra eggs. My great grandma also took in ironing work, and she charged to iron clothes for some for other families. So there were little things, extra things that they did to bring in money as well. And that's something that you can implement today as well, and it's something that I'm looking at doing for myself right here and right now. So anyways, that's a little bit about the lifestyle that my great-grandparents had, and I consider it sort of a blueprint for how I would like to live my life, and I think it's something to consider for anybody out there who wants to be a prepper. It's not all about what you buy, it's not all about what you store. Prepping really ought to be a lifestyle and a way that you live your life. Hope you got something out of this video. As always, I appreciate every like, every comment, and every subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.